Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. We're going to get started on our next lecture series, Urban Sociology, a topic that's very near and dear to me. Urban sociology is all about trying to make sense about how our individual experiences are shaped by urban areas, what we might call cities. Let's do a couple of things in this lecture series. I want to spend some time thinking about what's urban sociology all about. I want to try and understand where it comes from and why it's important. I want to think about how places and spaces where we live might shape our experiences, particularly going back to that critical lens from sociology's third lens, thinking about how resources might shape that experience. Likewise, I want to think about how inner city areas are created. This is something that is often overlooked in conversations about sociology. So I want to spend some time thinking about the creation of the inner city area. And more importantly, I also want to reflect a little bit about what the long-term effects of living in these areas might be. Now, when we talk about urban sociology, and at the heart of it, we are simply talking about the idea of how a city can shape an individual's life experience. We can put the places where we live, urban, suburban, rural, into this whole sociological imagination that C. Wright Mills wrote about. And we can think about how the individual's experience, because they live in a city now or lived in a city in the past, could have been shaped in some small way. Urban sociologists are also interested, too, in how we understand and interpret the landscape of an urban area, which can be very detailed, nuanced, and have lots of meaning that sometimes we don't see in rural areas in the same way. Now, where does urban sociology come from? Well, I have exciting news. It came from the United States not once, but twice. In fact, this was a field that was developed in Chicago back in the 1920s, back when they were making an argument that cities built themselves around circular designs. As strange as that sounds, they called it the concentric design theory or concentric zone theory, I think. Today, we kind of say, well, okay, that's great, but maybe there's more to it. In fact, in the 1980s, a new variety of urban sociology that was a very resource-based critical urban sociology popped up in New York University, as well as the University of California at Santa Barbara, two places where political economists, folks like me, were thinking about how the political arrangements in our areas interlapped with the economy and how that shaped the individual experience. At the heart of it, though, throughout urban sociology has been a focus on resources, how the things that are available to us based on where we are in a city can really shape our experiences in some really unpredictable ways. And we'll dig more into that as we go along. We need some working definitions. We need some basic ideas about what we're talking about here. You probably already knew this, but when I say an urban area, you can effectively think of that as a large city. It's a high population density. High population density means that there's a whole bunch of people around you pretty much all the time. A place where lots of people are living in multi-use buildings or multi-resident buildings, such as apartment buildings, rather than everyone owning their own house. These are also something that overlaps with something we call metropolitan statistical areas. Now, a metropolitan statistical area, or an MSA, is literally the idea of what you're thinking of when you think of a big city. Metropolitan statistical areas include large areas in places like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and so forth. As you get more and more people concentrated into an area, the more urban it's becoming. When we think about places like the city of Richmond, where many of you may be living or going to college or going to work, we need to suss out if that's really what we're thinking about when we say urban. As a result of that, what I want to do in the next few slides is spend some time exploring what it means to be urban. And I really want to work with this idea of the metropolitan statistical area as our definition of urban, and also answer that universal question: is the city of Richmond really an urban area, even though it identifies itself as a city? We'll have an answer to that before we're done. Let's talk about Lexington first. Now, for those of you who live in the Richmond area, Lexington is, of course, our large city, just up I-75 from here. Lexington is a big area, and it's interesting because when we think about the metropolitan statistical area, we don't just think about the city of Lexington. In fact, a metropolitan statistical area includes the city, at the center of it, but also the likely neighborhoods where people who work in the city of Lexington are probably going to live. Basically, the idea here is we're covering people who might be commuting to work in Lexington. So we'll include folks who live in Lexington. But then we're going to go out into those neighboring suburban areas where a lot of people might be living in houses and so forth and are commuting to Lexington. And we're going to include all of that in our metropolitan statistical area. So there's the city of Lexington, but the metropolitan statistical area would be called the Lexington-Fayette Metropolitan Area. Now, for short, you could call it the Lexington MSA, and everybody's going to know what you mean. But if you say just Lexington, well, that would be the city of Lexington. But if we say Lexington MSA, we know that includes Lexington, the city, but it also includes Georgetown, Nicholasville, Winchester, Paris, Versailles. Did I say that right? Wilmore, never been there. Midway, Millersburg, Stamping Ground, North Middleton, Sadieville, and Corinth. A whole bunch of other places ranging down to Corinth that has a 230-person population, but it's still considered part of the Lexington-Fayette metropolitan area. Just as a point of reference, Lexington, even though it feels big, it's really not all that big in the scheme of things. It's the 106th largest, last I checked, in the United States. Cincinnati, for example, would be much, much bigger. But it does include all of Fayette County, and it includes just over 500,000 people in the Lexington-Fayette metropolitan area. So that's our first experience with a metropolitan statistical area. Remember, a city is an identified area like the city of Lexington. But then we build on that by thinking about where the people who work in Lexington might live, and then we expand that to form what we call a metropolitan statistical area, or MSA. Again, the Lexington area for the MSA is Lexington and Fayette County. So see how it's bigger than just Lexington. What about where we might live? Well, for those of us who live in places like Madison County, it gets a little trickier. We've certainly got just up the street from us the Lexington-Fayette MSA. Richmond and Berea are technically not part of that. In fact, they are part of something else. There's the Richmond-Berea Micropolitan Statistical Area. Now, the Micropolitan Statistical Area combines these smaller cities that surround the Lexington MSA but aren't part of its actual MSA. The argument here is that probably you won't find a lot of people living in Richmond and driving to Lexington for work. You might find some, but the bulk would probably work in places like Richmond or Berea, or even in surrounding Madison County. That's where we get the Micropolitan Statistical Area. As such, Richmond and Berea, we feel, are very interlinked in that sense. And that makes sense because a lot of people live in Berea and work in Richmond. A lot of people live in Richmond and work in Berea. And they also work in these small little towns across Madison County. But they maybe don't go all the way up to Fayette for work. They might drive up there for all sorts of things like medical services, retail, and more, but they work inside this micro area of Richmond and Berea. So this is a cool thing. We have the Lexington MSA, that's the Metropolitan Statistical Area, but then we have the Richmond-Berea Micro Statistical Area, or what we just call the Micropolitan Statistical Area, or micro. And see how we don't use MSA again, because Micropolitan would be MSA. So we use the word micro. So we have the MSA and the micro. So what happens when you combine those? Well, when you combine them, conveniently enough, you get a combined statistical area, or CSA, and that's where we have added in the metropolitan statistical area, the micropolitan statistical areas together to form the CSA. If we looked at that, in this case, we would be adding the Lexington-Fayette MSA to the Richmond-Berea Micropolitan Statistical Area to make our CSA, or Combined Statistical Area. And the whole idea with a CSA is that you're pretty much capturing all the work and economic resources that are moving around in that area, more or less, that are high-density areas. Now, there's a whole bunch of low population density areas around them, and you're going to learn in a later lecture that's what we call rural areas. We're not going to go any further than that because we've got a whole lecture on rural sociology coming up. Let's learn just a bit more about some of the MSAs that we have. So when we look at the biggest urban MSAs in the United States, we start with New York City, greatest city in the world, I've been told, per Hamilton. That's followed by Los Angeles and Chicago. Those are our three biggest MSAs, and look at the population differences between those. New York City MSA, which, by the way, covers multiple states. It includes New York, Newark, Jersey City, and that covers New York, Jersey, Pennsylvania, metropolitan statistical areas. That's big, right? But that's 20 million people. It's a whole bunch of folks. Los Angeles, which includes Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Anaheim, all in the state of California, is around 13 million. Chicago is half of New York City, and it's still massive, and it covers Chicago, Joliet. I never can say that right. Joliet. And Naperville, which is Illinois and Indiana and Wisconsin, all together in Chicago, and it still hasn't broke half of what New York City is. Now, a couple of MSAs are on the rise. In fact, DFW, Dallas-Fort Worth, and Houston are a good example of those. They are rapidly catching up with Chicago. I don't know if any folks are theorizing that they may actually surpass Chicago someday. I don't know, but a lot of places in Texas are rapidly growing. So those are just some examples of our largest MSAs in the United States. All right, that's going to wrap it up for our early conversations about urban areas. Remember, we've talked about some basic terminology. We've talked about urban sociology as this field really interested in how living in an urban area shapes your experience. We've talked about how this is an American field, came from the Chicago area in the 1920s, and then 1980s we saw it popping up at NYU and in California, and a more resource-interested perspective on how the resources available in certain urban areas shape your experiences. We also talked about the Metropolitan Statistical Area, or MSA. We've also talked about micro areas, Micropolitan Statistical Areas, and we've talked about putting those two together to get a combined statistical area. We also talked about the biggest MSAs in the United States, and that being New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago, followed by DFW and Houston in Texas. That wraps it up for this lecture. If you have questions about urban sociology or any of the terms we've talked about, let me know. Send me an email, stop by office hours. I'm here to help. Otherwise, I will see you in our next lecture when we start talking about urban ecology. Thanks.